Harrington exhaled slowly and said there were too many to count. Below, the ocean boiled with debris. A burning oil slick stretched for miles. Life rafts bobbed among the wreckage, Japanese pilots clinging desperately to survival. But the battle was decided. Their air arm was gone. By mid-afternoon, the tally was staggering. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed. American losses, fewer than 30. It was not just victory, it was annihilation. Harrington looked at the smoke curling into the sky and understood with quiet certainty that this was the breaking point. And the moment when the Zero, once feared, once legendary, died. The myth had burned away, and the Hellcat had claimed the sky. By late afternoon, the Pacific was still. No more black swarms, no more burning arcs of falling planes, only smoke, only silence, only the steady hum of carriers moving west. Lieutenant Commander David Harrington guided his Hellcat back toward Task Force 58. The battle had lasted hours, but to him it felt like a single breath held too long. He glanced at his instruments, fuel low, ammunition nearly gone, hands trembling on the stick. He radioed the Independence and announced he was returning to base. The reply came calm and steady. He was cleared to land. He brought the Hellcat down onto the rolling deck. The arrestor hook caught. The fighter slammed to a halt. Engines cut. For a moment he just sat there, sweat dripping, heart hammering, alive. On the flight deck the air was electric. Pilots climbed from cockpits, some grinning, some dazed, and some so exhausted they could barely walk. The smell of gunpowder still clung to their uniforms. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, patching holes, checking fuel, rearming guns. The battle wasn't just won, it survived. Ortiz staggered over, helmet tucked under his arm, still catching his breath. He told Harrington he couldn't even begin to count how many had gone down that day. Harrington looked out toward the horizon, where oil slicks still glimmered, where aircraft had vanished. Eden said softly that neither could he, but that he knew what it meant. That night on the carrier's mess deck, the mood was surreal, not grim, not heavy, almost celebratory. Men laughed and traded stories, voices buzzing like a carnival, pilots recounting kills with hands cutting the air, reliving dives and gun passes and explosions. But beneath the noise there was something unspoken. Every man knew how close it had been, how easily the tide could have shifted, if not for the Hellcat, if not for the training, if not for the sheer weight of American industry behind them. Captain Walter Green addressed the squadron late that evening, his voice carrying over the hum of engines and the distant crash of waves. He told them plainly that today they had not weakened Japanese carrier aviation, they had destroyed it. He let the word sit. Then came the numbers. Nearly 400 enemy aircraft gone, and they had lost fewer than 30. The room fell silent. Numbers had a way of cutting deeper than words. Harrington thought back to 1942, back to Pearl Harbor, back to the helpless feeling of flying a Wildcat against a Zero that could twist around him like smoke. 2 years ago, it had been in despair. Now it was supremacy. He leaned against the rail that night, staring out at the endless Pacific. Fires still burned faintly on the horizon. Somewhere out there, survivors floated in the wreckage. Young Japanese pilots, boys really, who had never stood a chance. For Harrington, the victory was sharp but not sweet. He whispered to no one in particular that they had broken them today and that Japan would never recover. The truth was undeniable. Japan had lost more than planes. It had lost the irreplaceable, the veteran air crews, the elite who had carried its empire across the Pacific. Replacements would come, but they would be children with 50 hours in the cockpit, flying obsolete machines into the teeth of Hellcats. Meanwhile, American factories churned out 2,000 aircraft a month, new squadrons graduating every week, each pilot trained, equipped, prepared. The machine of war was unstoppable now. By midnight, the tally was official. 395 Japanese aircraft destroyed. American losses, 29 planes. A kill ratio better than 14-1. It was more than numbers. It was a turning point. The men of Task Force 58 would never again fear the Zero. From this day forward, the Pacific was theirs. And the morning after, the Pacific was still. No swarms of Zeros. No black columns of smoke clawing into the sky. Only the quiet hum of carriers moving steadily west. But for history, nothing would ever be the same. On June 19th, 1944, Japanese naval aviation died, not with a whisper, not in retreat, but in fire, in smoke, in silence. Nearly 400 aircraft lost in a single day. Veteran pilots gone. Decades of experience gone. A force that had once terrorized the Pacific, shattered forever. And for the men of Task Force 58, the meaning was clear. From this point forward, American carriers would sail where they wished, strike when they wished. The sky was theirs. The Hellcat had done more than win a battle. It had ended an era. Fast, heavily armed, forgiving in the hands of a rookie, and deadly in the hands of a veteran. By war's end, it would account for more than 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. Its kill ratio of 19-1 remains one of the greatest in aviation history. But numbers tell only part of the story. The real legacy was in what the Hellcat represented. It was not a miracle plane. It was not untouchable. What it was proof. Proof that industrial might, training, and adaptation could overcome myth. Proof that lessons written in blood at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea had not been wasted. Proof that America had found its rhythm of war. While Japan clung to a shrinking cadre of elite pilots, America built thousands. And while Japan produced a few hundred planes a month, America produced thousands more. The balance was not just tilted, it was crushed. Lieutenant Commander David Harrington never forgot that day. Not the roar of the engine, not the flash of tracers, not the sight of young Japanese pilots falling into the sea. He remembered standing on the deck that evening, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in blood-red light. The Hellcats lined up along the carrier, wings folded like silent guardians. The men around him laughing, alive, victorious. And yet beneath it all, a heaviness. Because Harrington understood what many would not say out loud. That those Japanese boys had fought bravely, that they had died believing they could change the tide, and that their commanders had thrown them into a hopeless battle. The legacy of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just victory, it was a warning. War was no longer about the few. It was no longer about aces. It was about systems. About machines, about nations that could outbuild, outtrain, and outlast their enemies. And America had become that nation. In the years to come, historians would mark June 19th as the day the Pacific skies changed forever. The day Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as a fighting force. The day the Hellcat became legend. For Harrington, Ortiz, Green, and Dalton, and the thousands who flew and fought, it was the day they proved something more than courage. They proved supremacy. From that day until the war's end, American carriers struck wherever they pleased. Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, all fell under the shadow of Hellcat wings. 3 months later, Tokyo itself trembled beneath American bombs. And when the war finally ended, it was Hellcats that circled above Tokyo Bay, guarding the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. The Zero was gone. Its reign, its legend, its terror ended. The Hellcat remained, symbol of an empire of steel, symbol of a nation that had turned the tide, symbol of the day the sky itself declared that the age of the Zero was over. The future belonged to the Hellcat, and the past, as it always does, still speaks, in fire, in smoke, in the silence above the Marianas. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than a victory. It was a moment when history tilted on its axis, when courage met industry, when myth met reality, and when the sky itself passed judgment. But this was only one chapter. The Pacific still burned. The war was far from over. And there are more stories like this one. Battles fought in forgotten skies, on nameless reefs, aboard ships that history nearly swallowed whole. Men who flew, bled, and changed the world without anyone ever learning their names. Those voices are still out there, waiting. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of that smoke-filled sky, if you stood for a moment on that carrier deck with Harrington, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to Warline Archives and step with us into the shadows of history. Every week, another battle, another machine, another crew of ordinary men doing the extraordinary. The past is not silent. It still speaks, and we will tell its story. 400 aircraft lifted into the Pacific sky. By sunset, only a handful came home. What happened on June 19, 1944, wasn't just another World War II battle. It was a slaughter so one-sided, it shattered the myth of Japanese air supremacy in a single day. You've heard of Pearl Harbor, but almost no one talks about the day America erased Japan's carrier air arm in hours. Before dawn, the Pacific was black and silent. A thin line of orange crept across the horizon as Task Force 58 prepared for impact. Engines rumbled across steel decks, fuel fumes mixed with salt air. Every man on board knew something massive was coming. Lieutenant Commander David Harrington climbed into an aircraft designed for this exact moment, the F6F Hellcat, built from hard lessons, armored, 6.50 caliber machine guns, a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine ready to roar. It wasn't just another fighter. It was America's answer to the Zero. Beyond the carriers, the ocean looked calm, but intelligence was clear. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were already in the air, possibly the largest strike of the Pacific War. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, but that name doesn't capture the chaos, the fear, or the brutal efficiency of what actually happened. In the next few minutes, you'll see how radar, training, and one new fighter turned the skies over the Philippine Sea into a graveyard, and why June 19, 1944 marked the beginning of the end for Japan's naval aviation. They were convinced they could break the American fleet. They had no idea, because in just a few hours the balance of air power in the Pacific would tilt forever. The invincible Zero, once the terror of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Coral Sea, was about to meet its reckoning. In the skies above the Marianas, the Hellcat would write its legend. What happened that day would not simply be remembered as a battle, it would be remembered as the moment when Japan's wings were torn from the sky. Only 3 years earlier, the story had been very different. In December 1941, Japanese aircraft ripped across the skies of Pearl Harbor. The Zero, sleek, fast, impossibly agile, seemed untouchable. It outturned every American plane. It outran them. It climbed faster, struck harder, and terrified anyone who faced it. American pilots called it a phantom, a machine that defied the rules of air combat. At Wake Island, in the Philippines, over the Coral Sea, the Zero carved its legend in fire. For young aviators like Lieutenant Commander David Harrington, those early years were brutal. He would later recall his first tour flying the stubby, underpowered Wildcat, a fighter that could fight, but only barely against the Zero. Every maneuver felt like suicide. You couldn't climb with it. You couldn't turn with it. The only chance was to dive, fire, and pray you escaped. American losses mounted, not just machines, but men. Pilots with only weeks of combat experience were thrown into the sky, and the Zero devoured them. The lesson was clear. If America wanted to survive in the Pacific, it needed more than courage. It needed a weapon. By mid-1942, engineers at Grumman Aircraft had begun sketching a new answer. They listened to combat reports from pilots who had fought and barely survived the Zero. Every weakness was written down. Every strength was studied. The design philosophy was stark. Forget outturning the Zero. Forget lightweight frames. The new fighter would not be a dancer. It would be a brawler. Thus, the Hellcat was born. A machine built like a flying fortress, armored cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, 6 heavy machine guns. It was not delicate. It was not subtle. It was survival on wings. When by late 1943, the first Hellcats reached the fleet. Pilots like Harrington knew it instantly. This was different. The Wildcat had felt like a compromise. The Hellcat felt like destiny. It climbed with power, dove like a hawk, and could take punishment long after a Zero would already be a fireball. And most importantly, it was simple to fly. Even a fresh graduate from flight school could handle it. But machines alone don't win wars. Behind every Hellcat was something greater. It's the relentless engine of American industry. While Japan struggled to replace even a few dozen aircraft each month, U.S. factories were building thousands. While Japanese flight schools cut training hours down to scraps, American cadets graduated with over 300 hours in the cockpit. The math was merciless. By 1944, the balance had shifted. For the first time, the Zero was no longer the hunter. It was hunted. The stage was the Marianas, tiny islands scattered across the Pacific. but priceless in strategic value. Whoever controlled them would hold the key to striking Japan itself. Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral Mark Mitcher assembled the might of Task Force 58, 15 carriers, hundreds of ships, nearly 1,000 aircraft, most of them Hellcats. On the other side, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa prepared his counterstroke. 9 carriers every pilot Japan could scrape together. Veterans, yes, but also boys barely out of training, some with fewer than 50 hours of flight time. Flying machines so fragile their very skin could ignite under a burst of tracers. The difference was stark. One side fought with experience, numbers, and machines built to dominate. The other fought with dwindling hope, fragile aircraft, and a myth that was already fading. Harrington walked the deck on the night of June 18th. The air smelled of gasoline and salt spray. He looked at his Hellcat, tail number 29, and felt a quiet certainty settle over him. This was not 1942 anymore. This was a new war, and by sunrise the Zero's reign would end. The dawn of June 19th, 1944 came with a strange electricity, not fear, not dread. Something else entirely, as if the air itself knew history was about to shift. Aboard the carrier USS Independence, the deck was alive with controlled chaos. Mechanics shouted over roaring engines. Handlers shoved fighters into position, when ordnance crews hauled belts of ammunition through the salt wind. Every man knew what this day meant. At the center of it all stood Captain Walter Green, commander of Air Group 22, a veteran of Midway, a man who had watched friends die in burning Wildcats. His face was weathered, his voice a low gravel, but his eyes were sharp and alive with quiet fury. He gathered his pilots at the tactical board and told them plainly that this was the reckoning. Task Force 58 was spread across 15 miles of ocean. The battleships guarded the line. The carriers held the punch. The pilots, they were the shield. He told them the Japanese would throw everything, and he expected everything to be thrown back. Hard. Beside Harrington stood his wingman, Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz, barely 20 years old, dark hair, quick grin, nerves of steel. He had only flown combat twice before, but carried himself like a man twice his age. Yet he asked whether the Japanese would come all at once. Harrington gave a half smile and said that the smart ones would, but that being smart didn't win wars anymore. Mass did, and mass was what Task Force 58 had in terrifying abundance. In the dim light of the Combat Information Center, radar screens began to glow. Reports streamed in, contacts, dozens, then scores, then hundreds. A tidal wave of enemy aircraft rising from the west. Admiral Mark Mitcher stood on the bridge of his flagship USS Lexington, tall, calm, expression unreadable. His orders came clipped and precise. Launch combat air patrol, vector fighters to intercept, hold the line. Far across the Philippine Sea, Admiral Ozawa gathered his own storm. 9 carriers, 400 aircraft. But his pilots were not the elite killers of 1941. Many were boys, driven by duty, driven by desperation, driven by the illusion that the Zero could still rule the sky. Where back on the Independence, Harrington mounted the wing of his Hellcat. He ran a hand slowly across the riveted skin. This fighter had already saved his life twice. Unlike the Zero, it could take hits and keep flying. Unlike the Zero, it was built not just to kill, but to survive. The deck beneath him trembled as engines roared to life. Commander Frank Dalton's voice steadied the squadron over the radio. A veteran of Guadalcanal, scarred but unshaken, he spoke with the calm weight of a man who had cheated death more than once. He told them intelligence had confirmed over 400 enemy aircraft, coming in 4 waves. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. He reminded them of their training. Boom and zoom, use altitude, never turn with a Zero, hit hard and climb away, live to strike again. Static crackled, then silence. Every pilot felt it, the shift. The moment before battle when the world holds its breath, Ortiz's voice cut through, sharp and fearless, announcing his intention to bag some meatballs. Harrington's reply was steady, stay on the wing, and they'd send them back to the sea. The order came after 8 a.m. Launch all fighters. Hellcats roared forward one by one, wheels leaving steel, engines screaming, blue giants leaping into the Pacific sky. Harrington felt the catapult fling him forward, then sudden freedom. The Hellcat leapt into the dawn, its 2,000 horsepower engine pulling him upward with effortless power. To below, the Independence shrank into a dot of steel. Above, only sky. Limitless. Waiting. At 15,000 feet, the first reports crackled over the radio. Multiple bogies, bearing 270, estimated 80-plus aircraft. The horizon began to darken. Shapes appeared. First faint, then countless. A black cloud stretching across the sky. Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo planes, all heading straight for Task Force 58. Dalton announced contact in a measured tone, but every pilot could feel the tension coil tight in the chest. The first wave was coming. Harrington banked above the enemy swarm. Altitude was life. From here, he could dive like a hawk, strike hard, pull away before a Zero could even respond. He called for Hammer Flight to follow him in, pushed the throttle forward, and the Hellcat roared into a dive. Airspeed shot past 350 knots. Wind screamed against the canopy. At 1,000 yards, he locked onto a Zero whose pilot never saw him coming. 6.50 caliber guns erupted. Tracers lit the sky like molten fire. The Zero's fragile skin tore apart. A burst into the cockpit. Flame, smoke, silence, and the aircraft disintegrated in midair. Ortiz's voice followed a moment later. He had a Judy bomber going down, spiraling into the sea. The battle erupted across 30 miles of sky. Hellcats slashed through formations, striking from above, then climbing away. Zeros twisted desperately, trying to force turning fights. But the Hellcat was too fast, too strong. When two Zeros dove at Ortiz with guns flashing, he shouted for Harrington. Harrington rolled hard and dropped in from above. His burst caught one Zero in the engine, and the explosion sent black smoke spiraling downward. The second broke away. Ortiz climbed clear. Everywhere, fire bloomed in the sky. Bombers fell in flames. Torpedo planes disintegrated before they could even line up a run. The ocean below churned with wreckage. Burning fuel, his broken wings, men bailing out into waves already slick with oil. For the Japanese, the attack became chaos. Pilots screamed into radios, trying to regroup. But the American defense was disciplined and relentless. One division attacked, while another climbed to cover. Fresh squadrons rotating in like clockwork. Harrington spotted a lone Zero pulling into a vertical climb, aggressive, skilled. This was no green recruit. The pilot twisted sharply, forcing a duel. For a moment, Harrington felt the danger. The Zero turned tighter, circling like a blade. But Dalton's words were still in his ear. Don't turn. Climb. He pulled back, letting the Hellcat's engine drag him higher. The Zero tried to follow and stalled. That was the moment. Harrington rolled inverted, dropped into a split S, and came down behind it. A short burst. Fire tore through the fuselage. The Zero became a falling comet, vanishing into the sea. By 10:30, the first Japanese wave was shattered. Dozens of aircraft had fallen burning into the ocean. Fewer than 10 had even reached the American fleet, and none survived the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire waiting for them. The radio crackled with new contacts. A larger formation inbound, estimated 120 aircraft, bearing 280. Harrington checked his fuel gauge. Still strong. Ammunition, over 1,000 rounds. Enough. Ortiz came back on the line, breathing heavy, voice tight with adrenaline, asking if Harrington was ready for round two. The answer was calm and immediate. Always. The second wave came like a storm. 120 Japanese aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, swept in a black tide across the Pacific sky. For a moment it looked endless. Ortiz's voice cracked through the radio, raw with adrenaline, saying it looked like a whole damn Air Force out there. Harrington answered with steel. Then they'd bury it. The Hellcats dove again. 36 blue fighters sliced through the morning sun, guns flashing, tracers ripping the air. The Japanese formation buckled on contact. Green pilots broke and panicked. Veterans tried to hold discipline, tried to form a shield, but the Hellcats smashed through like thunderbolts. Harrington lined up a Val dive bomber, its bombs slung beneath the fuselage. One burst. Flames engulfed it. The bomb detonated midair, scattering fire across the sky. A Zero latched onto Harrington's tail. Gunfire stitched across his wing, and the Hellcat shuddered. He rolled hard left, dove straight down. The Zero followed, too close, too eager. At 5,000 feet, Harrington snapped into a climbing turn. The Hellcat's engine dragged him upward. The Zero tried to match him and stalled. Harrington reversed, came down like a hammer, and his guns blazed. The Zero erupted in fire. All across the sky, the same story played out. Hellcats used altitude, speed, and firepower to shred the enemy. Zeros twisted and turned, clawed for advantage, but they could not win. Not anymore. Captain Walter Green's squadron intercepted the torpedo bombers, the Nakajima B-5Ns, the very aircraft that had gutted Pearl Harbor. They crawled toward the fleet at barely 200 miles per hour. Against Hellcats, it was slaughtered. Green himself destroyed 2 in a single pass. Others followed until the ocean was dotted with wreckage. Still, the Japanese pressed on. By noon, a third assault was spotted. Another 80 planes. Ortiz whispered that he couldn't believe it. Harrington steadied him, telling him this was everything, their last strength. The Hellcats rose again. By the end of that single day, Japan had lost over 300 aircraft. The Americans lost fewer than 30. Pilots who survived would later call it, with dark humor, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for the men who flew that day, for Harrington and Ortiz, for Green and Dalton, it was never a hunt. Why, it was a reckoning. The day they proved that courage without machines was nothing, and that machines without men were less than nothing. Together, on June 19, 1944, they had done what once seemed impossible. They had killed the legend of the Zero. And above the Marianas, the Hellcat had written its own. Fresh squadrons launched as others landed to refuel. The rotation was seamless, endless. Where one flight ended, another began. The third wave was even younger. Pilots barely out of school, some so green they could barely hold formation. And yet they came. Harrington dove on a Judy bomber and ripped its engine apart. The pilot bailed, parachute opening, drifting helplessly into the sea below. Ortiz destroyed a Zero with a single clean burst. The radio was alive with voices. Splash 1, got another Val. They're falling like flies. The sky itself seemed on fire. Smoke trails crisscrossed the heavens. Aircraft spiraled into the sea, exploding into walls of flame. The Pacific became a graveyard of burning wings. After 1 p.m., radar picked up a fourth wave. Smaller, only 50 aircraft. But these were not elite squadrons. These were scraps, training planes, obsolete machines, anything that could fly. Dalton's voice cut across the channel, telling them simply to finish it. The fourth wave barely reached the Americans. Hellcats tore them apart with ruthless efficiency. Old biplanes burned in seconds. Their twin-engine bombers lumbered forward only to be ripped to shreds. By the time the wave collapsed, the Japanese had nothing left. And then silence. Harrington leveled out at 12,000 feet and scanned the horizon. The once crowded sky was empty. No more swarms, only smoke, only wreckage. Ortiz's voice broke through, quieter now, asking how many they thought they'd gotten.